big data, big challenge for the market research industry. I think there are huge opportunities for us. It generates completely new ways of understanding the market, understanding consumers. But there are also some serious threats to our current business model, as frankly much of market research is largely based around engaging with consumers and asking them questions, which is fundamentally what big data as it currently stands doesn't seem to be about. So I don't think we need to dwell too long on the understanding that big data has had a meteoric rise and continues to have a meteoric rise. And really that's reflective of the way in which so much of our lives are now played out in a digital environment, our socializing, our consumer consumption activity, our working, and of course as devices become more and more IP enabled, our fridges, our microwaves, our toasters and so on, then more and more data starts falling into the realms of big data. And clearly the expectations of what big data can deliver are extremely high. There's a sense of an understanding that big data can provide some very tangible results in real time, and that we're able to sort of flex and swap it around and combine sources. So I think one of the questions which is being asked, and which is relevant to us as a market research industry, is why should people pay for difficult and time-consuming market research that doesn't always have a very tangible ROI? That's a fair question, but should we be treating the promise of big data with some caution? Is it really going to answer all the questions which a business needs for its market and consumer strategy? I think there are a number of assumptions around big data that we as an industry really need to properly address and challenge. I think one of the ones I start off with is the implicit suggestion in much of big data analytics that it fully reflects our inner lives. So the traces we leave are increasingly reflective of the types of people we are. And to some extent I buy that, but I don't buy that it'll ever be fully enough. I don't think that the traces we leave will really pick up sufficiently on the emotions and our attitudes and the complexity of our human inner lives. And at some point we need to engage in the messy process of asking people questions or engaging with people and talking to them, essentially. Another key assumption around big data is that we need to simply observe in order to understand, kind of related to the previous one, but I think much of big data analytics is atheoretical. I think Chris Anderson in a famous article was suggesting that, famously touting big data as the end of science. So the way in which it would work out with ourselves and our interests is that we wouldn't necessarily need an understanding of consumers, we just need to look at the relationships in the data. Now, my view, and the view I think that we should be taking as an industry, is to start questioning that suggestion, which I think is fundamentally tactical and limited. Third one, big data remains behind the firewall. So, and this seems to be an increasingly vocal argument that's being made, and frankly, that I can understand the argument that that companies are very sensitive and data should be remaining in a very secure place, but fundamentally the challenge with that is that you then only see your data, so you have a limited view of the market, and I think market research is really in a position to help aggregate and inform a wider understanding. And finally, I think that another assumption around big data is that the individual is the only valid unit of measurement. Now, I don't think that's something which is peculiar to big data. I think that's also an issue which affects us in market research as well. But what big data allows us to do for the first time, in fact, is actually allows us to start exploring those social relationships within the data. So I think I just want to just move on to just talking about the way in which I think big data is perhaps not the panacea in its own right, and we need to start creating a bit more of a vision about what big data looks like from a market research perspective. And it's worth just talking briefly about the way in which data is currently used and published. There's a report which a guy called John Ioannidis put together, which most alarmingly identified that most published research findings are false. Now, obviously, somewhat alarming for us as an industry to read that sort of finding, but I think the point which he was making is that this is largely due to a lack of understanding of the context in which people often find themselves. So there's a lack of realism about being able to distinguish the absolute effects and real effects of what's going on from spurious relationships. Secondly, and I think we're all familiar with this issue as well, is that we are still dependent on individuals to interpret data. Simply because we've got a lot of data doesn't mean that we've got a foolproof way of interpreting that data. And I think Nate Silver, in his book Signal and Noise, which is definitely recommended reading on this area, makes the point that those two issues together really mean that large-scale data sets can simply mean more errors. So it's not the easy solution which we necessarily might hope for, the purely technical solution which we might hope for to answer all of our business questions. And fundamentally, there is a sort of social science and consumer understanding which needs to come into it in order to provide context and in order to provide the appropriate interpretation. So I think as a profession we need to start articulating a new approach to big data, moving it to what we're starting to seem to be calling it smart data. And just to refer back to Nate Silver, he makes a convincing argument about the use of Bayesian approaches, which I think form a pretty good way of us starting to think about data analytics and data sets. And it's really about intelligent ways of dealing with large-scale data sets, which fundamentally really reflects an awful lot of the best practice which is currently going on within market research. So number one, the key principles of the sort of a Bayesian approach is, number one, consider the context. So really that by understanding the context in which we find ourselves, we're much better able to start filtering out spurious relationships when they appear. Dealing with false positives, this is particularly important when dealing with large-scale data sets, as of course we're more likely to be encountering false positives. If we explicitly understand that and explicitly start measuring them, we're in a stronger position. Outcomes of Bayesian approaches are generally stated as probabilities rather than absolute numbers. Again, I think more realistic for our sort of non-linear and sort of multifaceted world in which we find ourselves. And finally, big data encourages more multiple use of data sources. So in nature of the sort of big data world, where the vision, the goal is to have a single customer view, but the reality is that much of big data is in separate databases, and part of the task is piecing it together. So just very briefly, and this is less about the stats and more about the approach, it's just useful to have a sort of tangible example of the way in which Bayesian thinking works. So a new service launch, and so the hypothesis is that the launch will be successful. So we start with a prior probability, and this is our context setting, that the launch will be successful. The context is, well, only 4% of launches of new products are successful. The hypothesis we're exploring, as I say, have we got new data? Well, the data to support that is that 50% of consumers consider that the service will be successful. We've then also got the number in there about the probability of false positives, which from our experience is 5%. The algorithm then works, and we're chanting out at the back end a 29% probability of the service being successful. Now, this is just an example of a very simplistic way in which the sort of Bayesian approach works. But I think it's useful just to briefly go through that, just to explain how these different elements can come together in a fairly straightforward way. So, what does a big data landscape actually look like for market research? I've tried to sort of started mapping this out very briefly, and this is where I've got to. Essentially, it's got a number of different levels on the vertical level, starting off from individual analytics, and this is where most of big data is currently focused. And I think our work here, for market researchers, is about joining up the dots, so trying to give an understanding of the total customer journey, looking at ways in which we can integrate survey data and observational big data to sort of better target, better optimize, better understand. The next level is around segment, and here I think big data analytics typically use behavioral data segmentation, whereas I think a smart data approach is about integrating attitudinal data to generate that kind of broader consumer insight in order to drive wider relevance and value. We go up a level, and we're at social. I think this is around sentiment analytics, which we're doing, obviously, as an industry, doing a fair amount of, but it's also identifying the networks that underpin our relationships. And there we might talk about influencer networks, we might talk about small world networks, and so on. And then finally, we've got the cultural level, where we're starting to see the introduction of digital humanities in the shape of things like visual analytics and Google's Ngram tool. I'm going to just briefly go through some case studies on each of those to help explain this. So first of all, at an individual level, here now I think we've done some work looking at purchase journeys. And here what we're able to do is to observe exactly what consumers do when they're online, so digital tracking of their experience. I think many agencies are able to do now. And that's obviously beneficial because it's quite hard for consumers to recall the detail of what they're doing. We can then understand how that behavior changes as they come into contact with different brand touch points, but also integrate that with survey data to look at what they're doing offline, understand why they did those different things at each point. So a bit of work which we did for Vodafone is where we recruited people who are planning to change their handset. They downloaded tracking software, and we complemented that with online surveys, and then we did a separate survey in order to scale up, in order to understand the total size of the market for those particular purchase journeys. Moving up to level 2, the segmentation case study we did some work here just to illustrate the point about segmentation. We did some work here with BT, who had a large prospects database, about 50 million households, and they wanted to leverage some better value out of that. So we did a large-scale segmentation of that prospect database, created some meta variables to reduce the number of variables around it, and then created a 7-segmentation solution. We then overlaid that segmentation onto recent acquisitions to look at which segments and which products people are likely to be using to switch, and so then we created a kind of propensity measure around that. We then integrated that with tracking studies so that we can then start looking at the market level and understanding the movements in the market and how it was possible to achieve some competitive advantage. And as I say, it's that through a combination of analysing the big data we've got, integrating the survey data, creating a segmentation solution, applying it to some ongoing tracking work. I think the third area to cover off in terms of a case study and an example of the sorts of ways in which I think we as an industry can be moving to a sort of smart data approach is really, as I mentioned, looking at the relationships between individuals. And here, I think, the work that's been going on, and this is Mark Earls has been working in this area, doing a lot of work in this area as well, has been looking at large volumes of sales data to look at the patterns in this data, to look at the patterns in the data. And so then from that, we can start understanding the degree to which there are people making independent choices versus copying, so to the extent to which networks are important, copying is important, and also the degree to which there are categories in which are easy to choose between and hard to choose between. By looking at that sales data, looking at patterns in that sales data, mathematically modelling those patterns in the sales data, we can then start understanding where different categories are sitting and where there are influencer networks sitting in a category, where there are no networks in a category, where it's random copying, and so on. And finally, I think the other area of big data which I think we need to start thinking about, and is probably not necessarily in the repertoire of what we would necessarily consider to be part of our portfolio, is around the whole area of cultural analytics. And I think this is a sort of new and rapidly developing area. And there, I think, essentially what this is about is that publicly accessible data sets are becoming digitized, allowing much more access and analysis. Ngram is for those of you who haven't played with it, it's a great tool to play with and look to see the trends in certain words over time. Alex Bentley has been collaborating with others to do some exploration of the way in which different words sort of change over time. It's worth having a look at some of the stuff which he's been doing. And I think it's just very interesting as a tool to start identifying and exploring trends over time. Obviously, another area that is starting to become useful is looking at analytics around images and developing large-scale databases of those. We've done some work on that on a relatively small scale of looking at people's living spaces. I probably wouldn't classify that as quite as scale of big data, but nevertheless, I think it's interesting how images and sort of cultural artifacts are starting to move into this category of big data. So there you have it. That's my take on the opportunities for us and starting to try to develop a little bit of an ontology, if you want a better term, around big data for the market research industry. I think there's some big opportunities, but we very much need to start making the case very strongly about the rationale for why market research has a very strong role to play within this. Thank you.